Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Prevention Perk. I am Steve Miller. I work at the Community Partnership of the Ozarks, and I am really excited about today's topic of discussion. For those that might be new in the audience, what the Prevention Perk is, in my mind, is just the same thing that would happen if you were at your local coffee shop. Um, Having a good cup of Joe, if you will, and you made an acquaintance there and you asked them, so what do you do for a living? Or what is it that you enjoy about your life or something? And you just get into a lively discussion about a topic that maybe you know nothing about, but you are there to exchange ideas and to make new connections and new friendships. So that's really what we've tried to establish with each one of these in the series. And so today I am excited to be in the coffee shop and learning about, I put it under the umbrella, and my guests may have a little different perspective on it, but I call it interpersonal violence. And there's a lot that's going on in the community of Springfield to address issues that fall under that umbrella. And so I'm excited for us to hear about what this coalition does, some of the activities that they have coming up. And and I'll let everyone know that we do this each first and third Thursday, 8:30 right here. An invitation is sent out each time. If you know somebody that might be interested in this format, forward one of the Zoom invitations, because we'd always like to keep our audience growing forward. So I will soon turn over the microphone, if you will, to three guests that we have today from the Community Violence Prevention Coalition. We will have discussion for I don't know, 20, 30 minutes from our professionals that have the experience. And then I want to take questions from the audience. Anything that keeps the conversation going. We try to limit this to 1 hour. So I won't push it if the conversation is not there, but I would love to have your feedback as well, because just like I said, I'm learning today along with probably other people in the audience as well. So from the Community Violence Prevention Coalition, I don't know if it's in any particular order as far as who's more of an expert or who's in charge, but Sunny Nutt actually is the operation director at the Harmony House. Maggie Rollwagon is the director of community education at Abilities First. And our third expert is Major Tad Peters with the Springfield Police Department. And together they all represent the Community Violence Prevention Coalition. So welcome to our guests. Welcome to all the other participants today. And let's go ahead and get started. This is the one that what I really like about today as well is we've had some people that came and did more of a formal presentation, but these three individuals just wanted to talk about the experience and talk about the coalition and share with us in just a general way what all this means and the impact that it has on our community. And I find that to be the most engaging for me. So we don't have a particular format in mind. But the thing that I would like to know from whoever wants to take the lead from this punt is just tell us a little bit about the Community Violence Prevention Coalition.
Okay, well, I will start. As Steve said, I'm Sunny. I'm with Harmony House. I've been part of the Community Violence Prevention Coalition and Family Violence Task Force. I don't know, maybe 2 years now. And I'm glad, Steve, that you described this as like a casual coffee shop conversation, because I will say Maggie and Tad and I did not put together a super presentation for everyone. We're really excited just to have a conversation about this. So Tad, I think, is going to talk with us a little bit about the history of the Family Violence Task Force, since I don't have a super rich knowledge of the history. And then Maggie and I can kind of talk about the Stop the Violence conference that's coming up, if everybody is okay with that.
Sure. So I'll go ahead and get started on the sort of the history with the Family Violence Task Force. Actually, I was one of the founding members back in 2012. I moved at that time into the position of criminal investigations lieutenant, and one of the responsibilities under that group is investigation of domestic violence, stalking, harassment, sexual assaults, that type of thing. During that year, we look at our crime numbers regularly, but we saw a big spike that year in aggravated assaults. And aggravated assaults can include a variety of things, but basically what makes it aggravated is either serious physical injury or a weapon being used. And it was a significant enough jump that we had to really do a bigger analysis of that and see what was behind the jump. And we found pretty quickly that about 50% of that number was domestic violence related. So we decided we really need to make an effort to bring community partners in, get everyone together and start to really address this as a community, not just as a police department. And I know there were all these other partners out there, the Harmony House, the Victim Center, who were doing various different things, but we wanted to really get our heads together and work together. So several things over the years since 2012 have come out of that Family Violence Task Force. We kind of put together a list of maybe a wish list of things we'd like to accomplish. And we've done pretty well over the years. We still have some more to do, but some of the things we started with and that we've achieved so far were the annual Stop the Violence Conference. That was the first thing that we did, and our first one was back in 2012. We've had one nearly every year. I say nearly because we've had to postpone it at times because of, well, most recently because of COVID, but also because of changes in the funding source and the schedule when that came in. But we've had them at times in the spring, at times in the fall. But anyway, we'll call it an annual conference because the plan has been to do it every year, although we've had to shift it a little bit as far as the calendar goes. We've been able to get really good speakers for that and pretty good turnout. It's the last several years it's been held at MSU. And it's this past year, or I should say, with Maggie's help and her organization, Abilities First, we're able to fund the conference that was planned for last year, but has now been moved to this year. And we've been putting a lot of work in on putting that one together. Originally, those were funded by various sponsors, including BKD, Verizon, but as with any donations, that kind of fluctuates from year to year, and we're glad to partner with Abilities First and have put on a good conference this year. A couple other things that have come out of the Family Violence Task Force over the years one was the fatality assessment, which is a program that started in Maryland. Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence actually did the research and created this, but it provides the officers with a list of specific questions that are intended to identify a domestic violence situation that has a high potential to become a lethal situation, so to become a homicide. And this is based on analysis of a lot of past events. So it gave our officers a tool to not just say, well, this looks bad, you need to get some help, but to say, based on your answers to these specific questions, we have a strong indication that this has the potential to become more violent and potentially lethal for you. And we want to put you in contact with these extra services. So the officers don't just, historically we had a pamphlet with some contact numbers, the various organizations that could provide resources. We'd hand that to them and say, here's some numbers you can call. Well, now we would take that extra step and say, here's some numbers we can call based on this lethality assessment. We really feel like you need that help. And we're going to sit here right now and get on the phone with you and start that conversation. So the officers were taking that extra step to not just leave a piece of paper with a phone number behind, but get them on the phone with the people who can provide the help to them. Next thing was the Family Justice Center. That was a big goal for that group for a long time. I went to several conferences from the National Family Justice Center Alliance, kind of researching, seeing what it would take to put that together. Of course, the biggest obstacle we had was funding for a long time, as with any big project like that. And then a couple of years ago, Greene County passed a sales tax, and a big part of that sales tax was some funding that the prosecutor, the sheriff, and the police chief were able to use for a special project to have a positive impact in the community. So Dan Patterson, Greene County prosecutor, came to Chief Williams and Sheriff Arnott and said, I'd like to use this funding to start that Family Justice Center. And that's how that came about. So now that the Family Justice Center has been in place for about 2 years now, they're really moving along, having good success in the community and serving a lot of people. It's essentially like a one-stop shop for victims of domestic violence, family violence, and of course they also serve those who are encountering sexual assault, other crimes. Anyone who comes in the door who needs help, we're going to find them the help they need. But we have partners in there, including the Victim Center, the prosecutor's office, there are police detectives, there are folks there from legal services, Child Advocacy Center is involved, Community Partnership of the Ozarks has a big plays a big part in there as well. So Those are some of the successes. We have some more things we'd like to do down the road. One is a domestic violence fatality review that's still kind of in the works. That's going to take some statutory changes to allow the sharing of information because of some confidentiality laws. But that's basically the quickest history I can give of that organization and where we've been going so far.
So I'll actually let Maggie follow Tad. Good luck, Maggie. Tad did such a great job. Just because he mentioned so much about how Abilities First is helping out with this current Stop the Violence conference, which, by the way, is October 6th. So put that in your calendar. Maggie, do you mind to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Abilities First came into the picture a little over a year ago, and this group has been really wonderful in reflecting their past work and their vision and welcoming us to the table, which is kind of why we're there. We want the community to know that unfortunately, there is some pretty staggering data about the prevalence rate of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities experiencing sexual assault and domestic violence. And so we kind of came in like, I came into the position in education, working towards educating people to have conversations and to learn how to better educate folks with developmental and intellectual disabilities about prevention. But I quickly realized this is an issue for the entire community, as are so many other things. So, you know, we're all more alike than we are different. And what impacts this community impacts the community at large. And so we linked arms and began to talk about this prevalence rate, which according to the Department of Justice is 7 times the rate of other folks without intellectual and developmental disabilities. There's research dating back all the way to the early 90s that tells us that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are abused at 90% of the rate. That's right, 90% of the rate. And oftentimes 49% of the time, 10 or more times within their lifetime. And if we were talking about any other community, there would be outrage. So we need to have outrage here too, and let that outrage fuel education and learning to work side by side, other professionals in the community to help change these numbers and serve this community of people. So I don't know what other direction you guys want me to go. We've got some really cool speakers pending. Some are lined out and some are pending. But our goal this year was to give information to our professional community and to our community of students and to the community that is inclusive. And I know that diversity and inclusion thing gets thrown around a lot, but I believe that this coalition is very purposeful about it. We're not talking about one group. We want to serve the all. I think in inclusion and diversity, when we focus most on one demographic, we are saccharine and we lose the equity in inclusion and diversity. So we really have to be mindful as a community to talk to everyone and not segregate our groups. And I think that causes a lot of misunderstanding, miscommunications, and stress. But when we have equity in inclusion and diversity, and we're talking about all people, that's the meat and potatoes of it, folks. That's what inclusion and diversity is. So we're very purposeful in a variety of speakers and their content matter. And I think everybody has really put a lot of effort into making sure that we're serving the all of the community.
Great job, Maggie. Thank you. Steve, I can let you facilitate. I didn't mean to just become the facilitator here, but I don't know if anybody has any questions about the Stop the Violence conference. I know one of the things that we also wanted to talk about today was how our individual organizations work in prevention and intervention of violence. So I'm happy to open it up to questions first about the conference, and then I can talk about Harmony House a little bit.
I would like to know, because I'd like to know, like, what's the format going to be for the conference? Like, do you know who the speakers are going to be? Maybe is there a central focus for this year, or is it broad and inclusive as well?
I'll speak a little to that. It's been a challenge. I'm not going to lie. We've had speakers lined up that then COVID hit, and then they weren't going to travel. And then we've changed the date, trying to accommodate. And with not knowing what what was happening in the world, it was very challenging to from the venue to the speakers. But what we do know is we do have our first keynote session is lined out. We're going to be hearing from Chris Worth and Jessica Naslin from the St. Louis area, human sexuality experts, self-advocates. Chris is a professor at Wash U. Jessica is a licensed, certified human sexuality instructor, which means that she can provide continuing education units for those seeking that specialization, and talking about prevention from the angle of Chris is a survivor as well as has a developmental disability. Jessica is a clinician, she's a therapist. We're planning on a survivor panel as facilitated by Paula Rector with some representation from different Harmony House. I think, what was the other organizations that are going to be represented up there with Paula? I know it was Harmony House and potentially the Victim Center, I thought, to just kind of talk about how no matter if it is a salacious, incestual, horrible, violent thing, or it is what some might consider on the other end of the spectrum that's not so violent, that trauma is trauma, and that survivors all experience that trauma, and a lot of the lingering effects that happen on down the line are the same, and that we have to start acknowledging violence for what it is and what it does, and not weigh it to take it more seriously on one end of the other, and kind of reflect on the paradigm and spectrum of experiences of survivors that have experienced different things. I don't know if I said that correctly, but that is what the panel will focus on. We're trying to get an attorney out of DC. We had her confirmed, and then she took a position in DC, but we're pretty sure we're going to be able to have her come back. Her sister was a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault, and her sister had an intellectual and developmental disability, and she will go through that entire case and talk about the things that went right and the things that went wrong, and how the legal system can work in the future to do better serving people with intuitive questioning and things like that. And basically, focusing on the fact that people with developmental disabilities are not adults are not children, and we've got to get better as a service system of serving them as an adult and not pushing them into services that are meant for children. Because with the best of intentions, we do that, but we have to build capacity within the community to serve everyone. And that's where abilities first comes in. I think oftentimes people say, you need to do this or we should do that. But then when it comes down to doing it, these agencies, these hospitals, these departments, they need help, they need support. We want them to serve the all, but they need support to do so. You know, Steve, we were talking earlier about how you went in and presented at the Real Choices, Real Voices conference. And at first there was a little bit of, you know, is this going to be applicable? How's this going to work? And that you quickly realized that it worked perfectly, because we find a way to connect. We find a way to communicate with everyone. And I think that's what this conference this year is all about, learning how to connect with people where they are and serving the all of the community. I'm trying to remember, guys, the other speakers. We have another speaker that I don't even know that I should bring up because it's not confirmed yet. We had to replace the second keynote because our other keynote did not want to travel. And we felt very strongly that coming out of COVID would be a wonderful time in October to try to have a coming together as a community in-person event. We're going to do our best to get this accessible virtually to the community. We're going to see how that fits in our budget. That's a priority, but that's not confirmed yet either. Does anybody remember the other speakers and the content matter?
think you've covered most of it. I don't remember the other speaker. I know that we have a little bit of work still to do, and I will be honest with everyone and say I missed yesterday's meeting. I was doing a training, so I don't know if Tad is there and he can add anything, but I think you've done a great job, Maggie, explaining it. I will say I don't know if everybody saw the correction in the chat, but it's actually Tuesday, October 5th, not October 6th. So I was a little off there, but there is a save to the date that's up on the website. So, and Christina, please tell me if I just talked out of my little butt again with that, but if there's not, there will be. Is there a save the date on the website?
It's on CPO's website, so yes.
Yep. That's what I thought.
And I just sent that message to you, not everybody, so.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I still appreciate the assist. So Steve, did that help answer the question that you had about the format?
Yeah. I just want to make sure everybody kind of had an understanding for what it was. I have another question because I love that Maggie and her organization are bringing a focus to, I'll say, this subpopulation that's all too often overlooked. But my question would be a connection between that audience or that population and law enforcement, because if it is such a high incidence of individuals that suffer violence, is this an underreported issue to law enforcement, given the nature of the population itself, in that they may not have the capacity to report it out, and there isn't an intervention or an investigation by law enforcement? And if so, if you're aware of that, what can we do? How can we help to facilitate a change in the way that is investigated or intervened with?
Boy, oh boy, what a good question, Steve. The unfortunate fact of it is even at the 7 times the rate, it's extremely underreported. And I've worked with the University of Arkansas. There's a group that goes out and they go and meet with folks in sheltered workshops and in the disability community. And what we find is that, unfortunately, a lot of people with disabilities live in, she liked to call it, a prison of protection, because so oftentimes those perpetrators are their caregivers, their guardians, people that they depend on to get out of bed, to eat, to travel. And so they become trapped in this, and this prison of protection, which can be their home, it can be supported living. And that's really sad. And what she has found is a trend in her research is that oftentimes the disclosure of this abuse happens years after the abuse, when they're finally have gotten to create some space between themselves and the perpetrator, who is so oftentimes the caregiver. I think that what we can do, there's no hard and fast checklist. If law enforcement does this, if we do that, this is why education is important. This is why so oftentimes we want people with disabilities to comply, do it this way, do it the way that we said. But that is what has perpetuated the abuse of this community of people, just that blind compliance. We have to teach choice. We have to teach people that have disabilities, and we have to teach people that work around people with disabilities and people in the community that these folks deserve choice. And we have to let them make that choice, even if it's risky, even if we don't like the choice they're making. It's very simple to start with just letting people know they have a choice, giving them an opportunity, including them in the community, and not putting them in the trailer out back behind the school. Any other folks get put in the trailer out back behind the school, heads will roll. But somehow our society has gotten to a point where we look at things different for this community. And so it's my job as an educator to help professionals open their mind a little bit and talk about the tough things. Let's take our blinders off and let's talk about this for what inclusion really is, and what roles and responsibility the community has in inclusion. And that is just being welcoming, good hiring practices, talking about human sexuality, talking about prevention, telling people they have a choice. I've gotten a lot of slack in the past because I've talked about kids and how kids don't have to hug everybody. I actually got pretty pissed when my daughter told me I couldn't hug my grandson when he was very little, and I had driven 6 hours to see him because I hadn't quite got there. And I'm like, why don't I get to hug him? Come hug your mama, And he's like, because, I'm 5 hours away. I didn't get to see him enough. He was very small. But just knowing that people if you can't tell your mama, no, I don't want to hug, how are you going to tell your caregiver or someone who's who is grooming or working their way towards doing something inappropriate and assaulting you, if you don't feel safe enough to say, no, I don't want to hug right now, how do you feel safe enough to say no to other things? So it's kind of a way that we need to start learning to change our mindset. And I find that we were able to go into the Springfield Police Department and do some training before COVID hit. And it was one of the most awesome things because we brought somebody with autism. Who am I to tell you about someone with autism? Let's experience that together. And we did a mock pulling him over because he drives. And, he was pulled over, modeled with a law enforcement officer in front of the entire group. And so that connection, that interaction, we just have to begin putting ourselves out there to make connections with people and learning that working with them is not a specialization. You just are getting to know them and meeting them where they're at and understanding they communicate differently. So the more relationships that the disability community has in the community at large, the more efforts towards prevention are happening, even if we're not specifically talking about prevention. They're building social capital. They're having people that they can trust, that they can learn from, that they can connect with, so that if and when something does happen, they can talk to someone outside of that prison of protection. They have that social capital. So I think that it's like an onion, that it has so many layers, but really it just speaks to the importance of what inclusion really is and what we're working towards by being inclusive in all areas in the community.
Thanks, Maggie. So you had mentioned, Sunny, maybe each one of you taking some time to talk about like your agencies and how they are, connected in with the coalition. So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Before I do, Tad, did you have something you wanted to add to what Maggie was saying? I noticed that you unmuted for a second.
Oh, it'll kind of fit in that or what we're talking about now. So I'll just go ahead and jump in if you don't mind. And
yeah, go ahead. And then
it'll be responsive to what Steve's saying right now, as well as where Maggie was going with that. Just from the law enforcement perspective on our attempts to reach out and reach those who would be part of that underreported group who don't feel comfortable calling the police. For us, it's all about relationships, and that's where we've seen the biggest improvement is like the Family Violence Task Force, like the Family Justice Center, like just community events where we get to build those relationships and let people know that you can call us when you have those issues and they're not afraid to do so. So now if Maggie encountered someone through her interactions at Abilities First and said, we need to make this report, it wouldn't be just a blind call to the police department. She could call me directly and we could get her connected with the right people. She could call the folks at the Family Justice Center. She can call, anyone who we've already built this relationship with. And we have an example just last night at the Family Justice Center. We had a client of one of the partners there of legal services who they had some concerns about because they lost communication or were concerned about their well-being. So instead of just making that 911 call and saying we need to start the process with an officer, she was able to call one of our detectives who works in the Family Justice Center, who they have a daily relationship with, and say, here's what's going on, what can we do? And then of course they're able to just initiate that process and start, tracking the cell phone and trying to locate them and, doing all the well-being checks and that kind of thing. So for us, from the police department perspective, what we've found works best and what we've gained from all this is the communication and that just knowing who to go to when something comes up.
Okay, great job, Tad. So Harmony House, and I think I've seen most of the people who are on this call right now, so most of you probably know and understand that Harmony House provides shelter and services to domestic violence victims. We have been very fortunate in the past to receive funding for a prevention education program. This year with COVID, we don't actually have that same funding, so we don't currently have a dedicated person providing prevention education. But I think a lot of the time, the way that we look at intervention is that it can also be prevention. So much of the work that Harmony House does is on the intervention side. When someone calls for shelter, needs services, we're there to provide those services to literally any person who's experienced domestic violence. So with that, though, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that we will accept people into shelter or into services who haven't experienced physical violence yet or at all. And that is a way that we help to prevent violence in the community as well. We have several different programs that kind of meet survivors where they are. We've got our shelter program. So again, any person experiencing domestic violence who can't safely live in their home can call for shelter. COVID has made it a little bit harder, I think, for people to access services for a number of reasons. But on our end, we've had to, during times where we've had to decrease our capacity, and then during times where we have very limited bed space, we are having to reserve those beds for people who have experienced more physical violence, just because there is, like Tad mentioned, that lethality potential there. And so that can kind of be a little bit confusing. We encourage anybody who's experiencing emotional violence, financial abuse, anything like that to also call, because if we can't serve you, we'll help you find somebody who can. We also have an outreach program that provides advocacy and education for victims who don't need shelter, or maybe they lived in shelter and now they're in their own homes, but they want ongoing support. So that can help them learn and continue to learn red flags and healthy relationships, and make sure that they are understanding how to keep and maintain healthy relationships, or if they're noticing their relationships starting to turn unhealthy, what to do about that. That's very hard, as we can all imagine, to just put into place after 60 days in shelter, and now you're in your own home, and then you have a new partner that you're interested in. How do you make sure that you're seeing the red flags and able to respond to those in ways that are protective and keeping you as safe as possible? So our outreach program will provide case management for years. We have one person in our program right now who's been in for 5 years. He's still going through the court system, so we're still providing advocacy for court, and then they're meeting about once a month. So it's very flexible depending on what the person needs and how often they want to meet, and what kind of support that they need. And then, as Tad mentioned, we also work with the Family Justice Center. We have 2 advocates that work directly in the Family Justice Center, and they are the frontline staff who greet and meet with victims who come in for services. So they sit down with the person, and they do work for Harmony House and the Victim Center. So every service they provide is confidential. They'll sit down with the victim and just kind of lay out all the services that are available at the FJC, and then also help them connect with services that aren't on site at the FJC. So they're really there to be an advocate, walking alongside the client as they're kind of moving through the legal processes, or if they're wanting an ex parte, whatever it is that person needs, they're there on site. And then just last year, we've had it for a whole year and a week now, we also have a victim advocate who's stationed with the domestic violence detectives in the FJC. Her name is Peyton, and she is a phenomenal human being. The cool thing about her position is that she's not waiting for someone to contact her to provide services. She's actually receiving her referrals directly from the domestic violence detectives. So and Tad helped me understand the police side of this if I get this wrong, but my understanding of the police side of it is when they get a report of a domestic violence incident, they're obviously taking information from both the victim and the perpetrator. That victim then their referral information is given to Peyton, and Peyton reaches out directly to them. So she's not waiting for that person to call for services. She's calling them and saying, hey, I'm Peyton, I work with Harmony House, and I got your information in this way, and we want to make sure that you know about services that are available to you. And she provides a lot of services over the phone, but she also sees people in person at the FJC. So Steve, I don't know if you have any specific questions about how Harmony House does what we do, but that's kind of the gist of it.
I can just add to that what you said, Sonny, about
ahead.
Peyton and the advocate. That is such a huge help for us, because one of the biggest challenges we find in, we get the report initially, we make an arrest, or get the statement from the victim, get the statement from the suspect, send it to the prosecutor. One of the biggest problems we had after that initial phase is over is we lose contact with the victims, and we're not able to get through the court process. We're not able to get them through and continue with Harmony House services, counseling they may need through the Victim Center, whatever it may be. We lose them because, for whatever reason, the hot and urgent situation settles down, cools off a little bit, and they kind of settle back into the routine, which can be a bad thing because the routine can result in more violence down the road. So that advocate has been a huge help for us, because she establishes that communication and maintains it throughout the process so that we can get them the help they need and get it through the court system.
Do other members of the audience have questions?
I guess I'm Shelby from Empowerabilities. We're the independent living center here that serves people with disabilities also, and that does include people who have developmental disabilities, but I haven't had any coffee. I'm drinking lemon water, so I don't sound very excited, but I am glad that, Maggie's joined this task force and that there is a focus on people who are vulnerable and have disabilities. So I'm just really excited to hear and see all of this and just all the training that's going on with professionals. And so just wanted to give a shout out to everyone. So excited. I did put in the chat, we serve people who sometimes are hiring their own attendants for their personal care. And I know there are some materials that we've seen nationally that kind of help people train how to do that. So if there is ever any opportunity for us to, be involved in that way, that's helpful for people who have a disability that might be a senior, or somebody who's living alone or something like that, that puts them in a whole different, category, because sometimes they may not even appear to have a disability. So those invisible disabilities in aging populations too sometimes are really vulnerable. So anyway, I just wanted to say hey and thank you.
I have a question about over the past year. So we've all experienced the pandemic in individual and unique ways, and from each of your respective organizations, and possibly through the coalition's interaction with other organizations. How has COVID impacted domestic violence, sexual assault, under that umbrella of interpersonal violence? Are you seeing more of it? Do you feel like maybe it's underreported because there is more people, let's say, in isolation? How's that been viewed over the last year to?
Pressure cooker. It has been a pressure cooker situation. I think Tad and Sunny would agree that I know that I serve on several other coalitions, and not to rabbit trail too far off of them, but much less calls into children's division, but much more reports of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. I can speak as a family with 5 kiddos, like it was all of us, but we noticed just so much stress and the unknown, and a mental health epidemic, an epidemic of collective trauma and secondary trauma. And I think that we're going to see effects of this for years to come. I'm not being despondent about it. I think our professional community will work very hard to support everyone, but it 100% has had an effect to increase the prevalence rate on our end of things.
Yeah, Maggie, I think you're absolutely correct. I will say from Harmony House's perspective, we did not see a decrease in our hotline calls. So our calls for shelter services, what the struggle we had was there were so many shelters not accepting people at all because of COVID. And so trying to help people find support was really tough. There were also several community organizations that for very good reasons had to either severely limit services or stop providing services. So because we were one of the organizations that we have a 24/7 hotline, we did receive a lot of calls for services that weren't even related to what we were providing. It was just related to, I need help and I don't know where else to turn. And so I think that was tough for our staff to kind of keep up with who is providing services and who isn't. One of the initiatives that we kind of undertook over the course of the last year is something called Mask 19, where because so many people were having to, purchase PPE or go to the pharmacy for different reasons, there were not a lot of ways to leave your home and seek services, or to be at home with your abusive partner and call for services. So we worked with the pharmacies here in Springfield to put out something we called Mask 19, which was basically you could call a pharmacy or you could go into the pharmacy and say, I need a Mask 19. And that sounds like a random type of mask, like the N95 mask, but it's just a code word for I need support, I need help, I need the police to be called to my address, whatever it might be. So that's one of the ways that we were able to do that. But Maggie, you're absolutely right. It's been a pressure cooker. And I do think that as things open up, as people are being vaccinated, we're going to see more hotline calls. And Ted, I don't know if you want to speak to it from the police perspective. I know you guys have seen a huge spike. I know Peyton has been working like crazy to follow up on victims. Right.
Overall in the police department, we saw a drop in our overall call load when the major shutdown occurred. The streets were empty, and we had a reduction in other crimes, burglaries and so forth, because people were just not out interacting. They were in their homes where, you know, they could prevent the burglaries and that type of thing from happening. But after that initial shutdown period, we saw an increase in domestic violence because, again, everyone's in their home together. They're locked in. They can't get, you know, that time away, go to work, and get frustrated more easily. And it just kind of builds into that pressure cooker situation where the violence can result. So, yeah, we've seen an increase overall in domestic violence. I'm glad that Maggie also mentioned the child crime reports went down. That was very concerning for us because we know that the victimization wasn't going down. We just weren't hearing about it. So we've done some outreach and trying to get through the CAC, get those reports and get them working. But yeah, sometimes a reduction in calls is not a good thing because we know it's really still happening. We're just not hearing about it.
Well, that it furthers my intrigue about, you know, the effects of COVID. I've read you know, a number of reports. I've been to different trainings, and I've experienced communities after, you know, a tragedy. For example, post tornado in the Joplin area in 2011, and the mental health, substance misuse, and those coping or lack of coping skills post trauma, and the spike was phenomenal. And so we haven't really. It's not like our tornado has ended just yet. We're emerging from COVID-19, if you will. And are there already plans, thoughts, procedures, things being discussed, not knowing what resources might be necessary, but anticipating that this could be a duplication, i.e., it's over, everybody's back to normal, but for a certain number of the population, they're not going to return to any type of normal because of what we've gone through, if that makes sense. And so how does each of your organizations, or how does the coalition, or how are we as a community poised to recognize that and then respond? And if not, are there things that we could, since I'm in the prevention field, start thinking about, or how we might, all of us on this perk, be lending some support to that?
I just want to say, draw a parallel to your very important point, Steve. The people in the disability community have been experiencing pandemic level isolation for years. So it's just so important to draw that in as we move in the discussion of how mental health is affected by isolation and crisis and things like that. We did a lot of internal, we were very concerned about our staff, you know, all of our helpers, and how much they were experiencing a pandemic, and how do we take care of ourselves as professionals so that we then can take care of others. So we started a mental health and a focus on being mindful of good mental health and mental health resources and services internally. And just, I think as a community, we're going to have to continue to have mental health be a point of focus and conversation. Being trauma informed isn't a hard thing. It isn't a challenging thing. So I think not only checking the trauma informed training box, but actually like looking at our practices and seeing, you know, we've had this training, but are our practices actually trauma informed, and taking a hard look at each of ourselves to make sure that they are, because whenever your entire world experiences trauma, and then every time the news comes on, the entire world experiences secondary trauma, and there will be triggers that come as we claw our way out of this, and we become united in community again, and we get outside and we get in businesses and have more people, and we don't have to wear a mask anymore, and all those wonderful things happen, because I have good faith they are. I hope we all do. Being mindful to check in on one another and take good looks at ourselves about what this trauma did and how it can resurface again and again, and how we need to be truly trauma informed, not just the checkbox, just like diversity and inclusion. It isn't a video, it isn't a training and then it's over. We have to take hard looks at ourselves and be okay with tweaking things and changing things around to meet the need of the mental health of our community.
I was just going to add from Empowerability standpoint, because our office has been closed since last March. So we've had to switch to like a Zoom platform. And I think for people who, use wheelchairs and have access issues and didn't have transportation, if they can figure Zoom out and have a device to use, we've actually seen people that we hadn't seen before that couldn't come to our office. So that's been actually an advantage. And I kind of hope we continue to do that. And then also thinking about how we've connected people. I was on a call Friday and we were talking about sidewalk access and just, barriers in the community. And we had someone from New York on who was able to kind of share their experience. So it was really cool to kind of see how, across the country, if you do have Zoom or some way of people calling in, you can kind of share experiences and network that way. So not that it's 100% making everything better, but I do think we've seen that it's helped a little bit. And I hope that we can find a way to continue and offer that so people can still join if they can't get there.
No, Shelby, I'm really glad that you mentioned like the positive side of it. Not that this has been a positive experience, but there are positives that have come out of it. And one of the things for us is during the last, I would say since July, we've only been accepting one individual or one family per resident room. And I don't know if everyone knows this, but we were accepting for the entire time we've been in our new building 4 individuals or one family. And the trauma of communal living is extremely real. So one of the things that the pandemic has allowed us to do is really look at the quality of our service provision and the quality of the residential stay that someone has here in our shelter. So we're able to do things like suspend time limits for people living in shelter. So while they're experiencing increased mental health and trauma issues, they're able to take more time to heal in shelter. There's not that pressure to come in, find a job, get into housing and get back out again, because that's just not realistic anymore. And we're also able to support by having only one person or one family per room, we're able to support healing in the sense that they're not having to try to heal alongside 3 other people who are also experiencing trauma. And we're looking at making these changes long-term, even after the pandemic. It might not quite look the same as everybody's quarantined in one room, but it will definitely have a really positive impact on our service provision and shelter. And then it's also, just like you said, Shelby, we're also able to provide telephone meetings and Zoom meetings for people, not just because of the pandemic now, but also because sometimes it's a barrier to service to have to try to figure out how to get into our case management offices. If you have children, we don't provide childcare for outreach services. If you have a job with work hours and you're trying to get to our outreach offices in a time frame that is also fitting with their work hours, and there's drive time to include or bus time to include, that's a big barrier to service. So we're also looking at how can we make sure that we're offering phone and virtual meeting options for all of our services, even going forward. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Other questions from the audience?
I was just going to say there's always a sunny side. When you said that, made me think.
That's such a good one, Shelby. And I just want to bring back up that if there's any way that we're able to make our conference virtually accessible, we are working really hard to try to do that. And that's like what you said, we talked within our group of how important it was that this actually was a good thing for folks, that one of our biggest unmet needs in the community for the folks I serve is transportation. The bus is a terrible timeline. It's overstimulating. It's a wild ride for a lot of the folks we serve, and it's not always an option, and there's not always transportation. So knowledge is power, and having access to information and people and resources virtually is so important. And that's just such a wonderful thing to take away and try to continue coming out of this pandemic. So thank you, Shelby, for that awesome reminder.
So in addition to the Stop the Violence conference, what are some other things that the coalition does annually, or maybe you're thinking this is something that we're moving towards, doing as a coalition or in the community? Is there anything on your on your agendas for that at this point?
As I mentioned earlier, there's kind of a list of things we'd like to achieve that we've been working on over the years. The next one, besides the conference that we've done some work on and would like to continue, is that domestic violence fatality review. I'm not sure if you all would be familiar, but there is a child death review panel that is based on state statute, and it's convened every time a child dies by accidental or criminal means. And this would be something similar, but on the domestic violence side. And it's being done in several other states. And basically, when we have a domestic violence homicide, we would bring together law enforcement officers, medical personnel, caregivers from other community partners, such as the Harmony House, the Victim Center, and do a case review and say, from beginning to end, what records do we have to show when this began? What interaction we had as law enforcement or as other providers throughout the process, and then in the end, and what could we have done better? How could we have prevented this? What can we do to better serve these folks so that we can prevent this in future cases? The obstacle to that is statute and the confidentiality issues that come in there. So Dan Patterson has worked with that, and we've done a little bit with the statewide coalition on Missouri Network of Domestic Sexual Violence. I may have that wrong. Sonny, please correct me if I have the letters wrong there. To work on changing that statute to allow communication in an event like that that would still be kept just within that group, but allow us to discuss and improve response and providing services to those folks. I think, excuse me, that's kind of, as far as I'm aware, that's our list for right now. The conference has been rather consuming the last several meetings, getting all that lined up, and that's typically the way this has gone over the years, is kind of focus on the conference for several months and then shift back to what else can we do. And since we've had the conference delayed now a couple times because of COVID, it's really kind of taken up probably about a year of our time, because we keep having to reassess and find new speakers. And so the conference has really been the main focus for quite some time now.
I know that the Family Justice Center was a huge vision, and I think it's been an asset that's filled some of the gaps that any community would face, but that our community was facing prior to its establishment. And I think that a full conversation just about what is the Family Justice Center and who are the partners in that, if you would be open to it, that may be something that we set up in the future in this same format to investigate. And the other part of that is, you know, there's still obviously some other gaps in addressing this issue. What are some of those that maybe other communities have found success with, and we don't have it in Springfield? You know, I know that you know, you can tell that Maggie is very enthusiastic about finally getting an avenue or a voice for people with disabilities. Are there others that we're just not aware of, or maybe we're just becoming aware of, gaps or subpopulations, those kinds of things?
I'm sure there are other, I mean, such as minority populations that don't necessarily have a good relationship with law enforcement in general. Much like a person with a disability not knowing who to go to or how to make that interaction, someone who doesn't have an established trust relationship with those who are providing these services is going to be less likely and less willing to call. So there are several groups like that I'm sure we could improve those relationships with, and you know, get the communication started, so when something bad happens, they know where to go and who to talk to.
Yeah, I'll back Tad up on that. And I'll also just say I don't know if everybody's familiar with the concept of othering, but any group that we would other. So Springfield has a really high percentage, as everybody knows, of substance abuse and mental health issues and poverty. And so it's easy to look at groups of people who struggle with those things as different from us. But really, domestic violence impacts every person, no matter where you're from or what you've done or who you are. And so I think just being aware of the resources that are available, being aware of the dynamics of domestic violence, being aware of its pervasiveness, and being able to support anybody who's experiencing it, whatever your role is in the community, is really important. Because I'm not as like fatalist as to say that everywhere is a gap, but there are a lot of gaps, and a lot of those can be addressed just with education and awareness.
I was going to say, I like the Lead Institute in Columbia, but I do know they've made a connection here. So they work with people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And I do know the Justice Center, I believe, has a video phone as well as Harmony House that can help connect people to interpreters. But I don't know if we would ever need to have our own, but I thought that was a really awesome program.
Yeah, they are extremely responsive. It's Deaf Lead. Yep, they're really responsive, and they will, I don't know if anybody here is on also a service program or part of a service program, but they will come down to Springfield and talk to people as well. So they do a great job.
Well, we have just a few minutes. Are there questions from the audience? Well, I certainly appreciate having our three guests here today, and if you do feel like it warrants further discussion, because I would love to learn even more about the Family Justice Center. I would like to have a discussion about that in the future, and there may be others that would be on that invite list besides those of you that are here with us today. But I think that would be a good subject to explore. We also have some additional perks coming up on May the 6th. We'll talk about foster families and kind of their role in prevention, family, and that sort of thing. We'll talk about mental health first aid on May the 20th, and we're going to try to give a brief overview of the three types of mental health first aid that are provided: youth, adult, and teen. And then on June the 3rd, we're going to talk about epidemiology. And we don't have anything in the queue beyond that. So I always ask if there are suggestions about topics that we can explore on future segments of the Prevention Perk. Please let me know, because I would love to explore those. It started out, we talked primarily about substance use prevention, and we'll still continue to do that, but we did have requests to venture more into some of the behavioral health issues that our community face, such as what we've been talking about today. So if there are other things that are of interest, we would love to hear them and feature them in the future. Like I said, this is a conversation format, and I'm hoping that we continue to do this post-COVID because we've had people that have joined us from other areas of the state, and I think that that's a great opportunity to not only share what we're doing here elsewhere, but also they can bring things from other parts of the state to us, and that we can share with not only Springfield as a community, but we serve 23 counties in Southwest Missouri. So even in more rural settings where some of our expertise can be duplicated. So that's my whole idea behind this, is that it's a conversation that will continue because it decreases that barrier of the miles. You know, it's not always easy to get people to drive in, but here's a way that we can disseminate out through the use of technology. And so I'm hoping that we continue to explore this as we go forward. So let me know if you do have suggestions for topics in the future. So I do want to thank everybody for being here, and thanks again to Sunny, Maggie, and Major Peters for joining us today. Hopefully you'll join us again in the future. Like I said, our next one will be on May the 6th, and we'll talk about foster families. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all.